So here we are, we're in Act 3, Scene 3. You can follow on the sheet or you can follow in your text, okay? There are different versions of Othello. If we go with the Arden version, this speech begins on line 322. Now, whenever you do a contextual piece, you need to know what came before it. Now, you may remember that Iago has just got the handkerchief at this moment, and he's been talking to Emilia, and we've seen the kind of relationship that they have. You may recall that when he greets her, she says, "I have a thing," and he says, "It is a common thing." And he's referring to the vagina, isn't it? Okay. So we've already infected that scene then with this polluting, highly sexual imagery. Now, in the essay I've given you, which I think is an absolutely superb essay, I'd like you to refer to it. Have a quick look at it now, if you like. It's the whole thesis of the essay, as I said to you before, is that Iago is an infection, a virus, a contagion, and he infects other characters. Now, they didn't know about viruses then, but you guys probably know that viruses kind of get your cells to create their own DNA. But when you think about it, that's exactly what's happening with Iago. And the characters that he infects begin to sound like him, don't they? And his language creeps into their discourse. In Othello's case, it is a complete possession or occupation or contagion. And we're going to see it manifest in this particular extract in a great deal of detail. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that sometimes Iago sees himself as a kind of alchemist. Remember that? In Act 1, Scene 3, Othello had been accused of being a mountebank and someone who used drugs, minerals, or charms. Remember that? Brabantio. So that's a common image pattern that comes throughout the play. We spoke last time, didn't we, about how Othello begins to define himself as other and takes on many of the racist tropes and applies them to himself that other people have applied to him elsewhere. Now, in this scene, we're going to see a lot of the imagery that goes throughout the play, and we're going to see in particular how Othello is infected by this, yeah? So the first thing that we were looking at was this idea of poison. Now, it's interesting because Iago uses a number of different images for his plot. We know that he uses birdlime. We know that he uses net, that he uses snare, that he compares it to a work of art or drama. Here he's calling it poison. Now this is something that is going to go throughout the play. And if you go back to Act 1, Scene 1, you will remember that Iago said to Rodrigo, "Poison Brabantio's delights." He goes on to say, "Plague him with flies." Do you remember that? So one of the things that you'll find difficult on the table is often these different images converge, and I'm going to be talking about that. They're not separate. They're kind of semantic fields in which the images often work together alongside one another and complement and intensify the power of the imagery. So he says here, dangerous conceits are in their nature poisonous, which at the first are scarce found to distaste, but with a little act upon the blood. There's your explanation for why he's using the metaphor of poison. At first we don't detect them, but they slowly sicken you. So he's using the kind of mentality of a poisoner. It gives us a great deal of insight into his strategy, which is this kind of slow poisoning that's going to occur. Remember last time I said to you, don't be too literal about time. I don't believe that the time in the play has anything to do with chronological time. See it as kind of psychological time, and see the act and this scene, Act 3, Scene 3, as being highly condensed idea of what may occur over any amount of time we don't know. He also says, burn like the mines of sulfur. So make sure in your table now you're keeping a record of this pattern of using hellish imagery. Now, what this particular essay says that I've given you, and I think it's correct, is that Iago will use a lot of these images less and less himself, and Othello will use them for him. He becomes a kind of proxy for Iago's speech. He goes on to say here as well that, and this is very similar to your Macbeth, you should remember this, don't you, this idea of sleep, that the poison that he administers will result in insomnia, won't it? It will cause a kind of insomnia, and it will not allow the mind to replenish itself. So it's an excellent metaphor of what this envy will do to Othello. He understands what he's doing. And that's why it's kind of ironic that other times he calls it physic or medicine, because obviously it's far from that. It doesn't heal, it actually destroys. So he says that all the drowsy syrups of the world will not give him sweet sleep. So his plan is very clear, isn't it? It is to cause him constant stress, insomnia, and disquiet. Okay, and when we see Othello, we see that the medicine is working extremely well. Ha! Ha! False to me. So immediately his speech is disintegrated, doesn't it? There's no iambic pentameter there. There are just these kind of inarticulate shouts, aren't there? And there's rage. Why? How now, General? No more of that. We've talked before, haven't we, about power inversions. By Act 3, Scene 3, Iago is completely in power. You'll notice that his speech is quite measured and controlled now, whereas Othello's speech is characterized by linguistic disorder on a metrical level, on an image level. He's not speaking within the conventions of noble characters in Shakespeare's day. That's something to look for whenever you're doing an analysis. At what point is Othello in his speech? Is he metrical? Is he composed? Or is it now disintegrating into a kind of doggerel, or into prose, or into this, where it's actually completely incoherent, isn't it? Yeah. And Othello's then shows that in his mind, he's thinking of these kisses on his lips. Okay. So from now on, he will start to absorb a lot of the sexual imagery that we've seen earlier with Iago. So even though that's not one of the categories on the table, it's worth mentioning, isn't it? We can tell that he's pondered and he's thought about the sexual imagery. And of course, the sexual imagery kind of relates quite closely to bestiality. And the fact that this sexual language is after this kind of so violent, bestial, and animal. That's why I say there's a convergence often, isn't there? With the zoomorphic imagery, the animal imagery that's going to come now. And then there's a speech here which is almost a parody of a genre called a farewell speech. It's interesting, I think, because the farewell speech was often a general giving up his command or the end of a battle. And here, Othello is, and this is what's so interesting, giving up his military career in the speech. Why is he doing that? Well, I think if you wanted to talk about gender, and you wanted to talk about masculinity, and you wanted to talk about relationships within that paradigm, it seems to me the case to be that he now feels that his rule, his military rule, is over. Why would that be? Because it's closely aligned to Desdemona's chastity. If Desdemona is untrue to him, why would it be the case that he sees himself as a failed general? And it shows the connections then between pride, masculinity, control, and the possession of a virtuous wife. His wife, if he can't govern his wife, he can't govern in the military either. And that's going to create all of this kind of image of disorder. He says, "You mortal engines, whose rude throats the immortal Jove's dead clamours counterfeit, farewell." Othello's occupation guard. So he renounces his military command, his masculinity is disintegrating, etc. And he starts to ask for a theme that's going to happen a great deal, the ocular proof. I've said to you before, this is a key quotation for you to learn. It links to the theme of appearance and reality. And it centers around the use of the handkerchief and what it means in your table to know. And what is the relationship between knowing and seeing? Now, as this is where, if you want to, you can bring in the meta theatre. Because Shakespeare, as a dramatist, knows that seeing is not believing. Seeing is seeming. And that's something that Iago shares as our Machiavellian character. He also understands that knowing isn't necessarily seeing, and that he's going to use appearances and manipulate them to an extraordinary degree. Now, an image, we spoke here about the poison, that links very much to poison, of course, is torture. And so in my little diagram here, what I've said is, this is the convergence of the imagery and the way the patterns work. We've got poison on top, but we've also got that closely linked to the image of hell, and also closely linked to the image of torture. So Iago's already told us that his contagion will work slowly but fatally. We'll see over here now that Othello's going to talk about torture, and that links to the idea of poison, or to the kind of paradoxical term that Iago uses of medicine. Earlier, you will recall, Othello said, "You placed me on the rack." Now you guys will remember a rack is a torture piece of equipment that stretches out your spine. It works exquisitely slowly, doesn't it? So it's a very powerful image. Likewise, that was complemented by Iago saying that you don't realize the poison's hurting you, but with a little act upon the blood, that it will be a slow infection. Okay? And then that brings in the next level of imagery, which runs throughout, which is the imagery of diabolic and damnation. And this is going to become extremely intense after that. I'm just going to go across to a different sheet. Now, on the essay I've given you, if you have a quick look at this sheet, this is what's interesting. 6 of Othello's speeches in the 5th act are infected with the language of demons. Okay? And what's going to happen is Othello is going to use those image patterns of religion and of hellishness and devils, etc. We know that he talks about devil. He calls Desdemona a fair devil. In Act 4, he talks about fire and brimstone, doesn't he? And perhaps the greatest of all speeches, he says, "O cursed, cursed slave, whip me, ye devils, from the possession of this heavenly sight." So we have these binary opposites here, don't we? Blow me about in winds, roast me in sulphur, wash me in steep down gulfs of liquid fire. Oh, Desdemona, dead Desdemona, dead, dead. So we see that kind of the death of the meter, don't we? There is kind of poetry in this, but it's not the kind of metrical composition that we saw earlier. It's a poetry of disorder and yelling, and that's why the linguistic confusion is mirrored in terms of his intellectual, his perceptual confusion as well. Going back to the passage, if you could follow with me now. Notice what Iago says, "O grace, O heaven, forgive me." So the imagery of heaven and goodness and godliness transfers across to Iago as Othello uses the language of damnation. So again, it's a kind of reversal that we've seen earlier, isn't it? You'll recall when Othello speaks earlier, he uses a lot of cosmic imagery. Now the imagery is inverted, and it's the imagery of hell, etc., that we're going to know him by. Again, in your table we asked about knowing and proof. He said, "I will have some proof. Her name that was as fresh as Dian's visage is now begrimed and black." Now the black imagery becomes almost fetishistic after this, doesn't it? And it's interesting, the play began with the black imagery being used by the antagonist and the villains of the play. It's almost as though he's accepted their version of himself, that he's internalized this racist imagery, and that he's going to use it all of the time. One of the things that you'll notice is he addresses himself in the third person. From now on, he will speak of himself as Othello. Now, is that some kind of disassociation, as he doesn't know who he is? Does that help us understand that final act, the final catastrophe where he kills himself, where he literally divides himself in two, doesn't he? In which he kills a Turk, and in so doing he kills himself. So to me, this is part of this cultural identity confusion that is going on. And this is where those post-colonial readings can be so generative. Now, Iago brilliantly uses the animalistic zoomorphic imagery, doesn't he? When Othello asks for proof, which would be to see them having sex, listen to what Iago says. Would you, the supervisor, grossly gape on? Look at this story here, the pause. Behold her topped. In other words, do you want her, do you want to watch your wife, in the midst of sexual passion with another man? You, the supervisor, so it's like one of those cuckold sites, that you can have a look at, is what he's saying. And it shows the brilliance of his ability to deflect. So the ocular proof, therefore, gets downgraded. It doesn't have to be captured in the act, does it? Instead, it can be this more tangential, what we could call, I guess, circumstantial evidence will be enough. And again, look how Iago drives home the jealousy. Is it possible that you would see this? Were they as prime as goats, as hot as monkeys, as salt as wolves, and fools as gross as ignorance made drunk? So we've got two sets of imagery there. We've got the zoomorphic, the animalistic nature of sexuality, converging with this other idea of drunkenness or drunkenness. And this, I guess, is that when you are so sexually intoxicated, that the idea of intoxication, you've lost your reason. It's almost like you're drunk or drugged. So it's particularly humiliating, isn't it, for Othello, because Iago paints this wonderful, vivid imagery of like absolute sexual ecstasy of his wife or somebody else, and the animalistic imagery is going to completely infect Othello after this. You will see in Act 4 and Act 5, he constantly is going to use the images of poison, of animals, of insects, of torture, etc. Notice who is doing all the speaking. Othello has literally been struck dumb, hasn't he? He's become inarticulate. He's like a sponge waiting to absorb Iago's poison as he works it into him. And Iago's watching him and he's torturing him slowly. So it's all about timing with Iago. Whether you like him or not, you have to admire him as perhaps the greatest villain in literature. He says here, this is a great scene, isn't it? Where he says, this is what I heard Cassio saying. In the midst of his sleep, he couldn't help himself. There's some great touches here where he says, oh, sweet creature. You'll notice creature could be animalistic, can't it? And then kiss me hard, as he plucked up kisses by the roots that grew upon my lips. So, in other words, he was so lustful in the night that he started enacting his lust out on Iago. Then laid his leg over my thigh and sighed and kissed. Look how drawn out the sentences. Look at the lovely thesaurus. And then cursed. Cursed fate that gave thee to the Moor. So this kind of extraordinary, vivid sexual imagery is something that is going to be absolutely internalized and infect Othello's mind after this, okay? And here, at the end, towards the end of the scene, we see the effectiveness of it, okay? I know not that such a handkerchief, I am sure it was your wife's, did I today see Cassio wipe his beard with. Wonderful sign again. I'm going to call it pollution effects. That he's going to say, he could have said, I saw Cassio with the handkerchief in his hand. Instead, he wipes his beard with it, doesn't he? So it gives this kind of sense of oral sensuality, etc. So again, this intensification of physical sexual imagery, which is going to again infect Othello's mind so successfully. Now he does speak more at length. And what does he say? All my fond lust, thus do I blow to heaven. So he's rejecting love again, and in turn rejecting heaven. Arise, black vengeance, from thy hollow cell. Yield up, O love, thy crown and hearted throne to tyrannous hate. So he's rejecting love, embracing hatred. He's changing his kind of religious influence, isn't he? And he's actually becoming kind of almost a satanic worshipper. It also converges, doesn't it, with the racial issues, as black here becomes his ability to manifest hatred and violence. And again, that seems to me to be part of this internalization of the racist tropes that are being used against him throughout the play. Then we have the aspects, tongues. So he's going to talk about, the poison imagery we have, don't we, coming through. So again, this imagery of. And then the final thing to finish off for today, we have the sea, the ocean, which occurs on a number of times. Never, Iago, like to the Pontic Sea, whose icy currents in compulsive course near feels retiring ebb, that keeps on due to the Propontic, to the Hellespont. We've talked about the Hellespont being so important in Greek mythology as a place of wrecked ships, etc. So here, what he is doing is he's calling upon this kind of imagery to stop any compassion. So the violence of nature is what he's embracing. And notice here, he talks about heaven, but see how he does it. He says, swallow them up. Now by yond marble heaven, in this due reverence of a sacred ground, I engage my words. And here's the kneeling and the curious scene that we spoke about last time, which is some kind of quasi-marriage scene or oath-taking scene. But they are not taking an oath to the preservation of marriage of Desdemona. He's taking an oath to her death. So it's almost like a kind of black magic ritual. And forgive my racist use of language, that just shows how forensically tied in these concepts, these negative concepts, are to race. So we've seen that this is a huge and really productive passage for looking at imagery, and it's given you another strategy to use when you are linking the passage here. You can also link not only through character, through plot, you can link through the complex patterns of imagery and symbolism and extended metaphors that go throughout the play.